join. We had talked about a couple weeks ago, I had raised the question about CMMC versus
Hmm.
HITRUST. And I'm just getting started with CMMC. So I have tons of questions about it, but I was kind of like, well, CMMC is different than some of the other uh, prior assessments and audits and things because it does have a certification and there's different levels of certification. And
Hmm.
so I kind of posed the question, well, how does that compare or contrast with HITRUST? And
Hmm.
so Kevin had, when I put that post out onto LinkedIn, Kevin had responded back and said, hey, well, there's this. And I'm like, I need you on this call so we can talk live and kind of kick the
Yeah.
tires and talk through that. So yeah, if we could, if unless there's other questions that have come up between now and when we last met that somebody wants to talk through. But that's, for me, kicking it off with that, and then as other questions come up, would be good.
Yeah, no, that sounds good to me because I'd love to. I always like to learn more about kind of peripheral from my perspective of high trust, not to
Hmm.
be
Right.
disrespectful to any of the other certifications, but just to understand them a little bit more, kind of everything in that cybersecurity ecosystem.
Hmm.
Because I think I often feel like high trust is this big whale as compared to some of the other assessments. But it would be great to have perspective on how some of the kind of FedRAMP or CMMC, those types of models or frameworks compare to the whale that is high trust.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when you compare the two frameworks, and I may look to the right or look to my left here because I have my spreadsheet up
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
with some of my notes,
Yeah.
and the areas in terms of how they all overlap, because we know at some point all of these frameworks overlap at some
Hmm.
point, whether it's
Hmm.
SOC, HIPAA, CMMC, PCI, they all overlap at some point. And that's one of the beautiful things about high trust because it captures and encapsulates all kinds of other frameworks into that one particular framework. And with this one in comparison to CMMC, they overlap in access controls. That's one area. Now,
Okay.
I don't know which specific controls or which specific requirements for each domain where they overlap, but they do have some similarities in terms of access controls. Also, in personnel security, from the AR standpoint, such as training, such as the checklist for onboarding and offboarding, both frameworks requires that level of evidence. Security and awareness training is another area where they overlap, of course. Configuration management, which deals with a lot of change control and baseline, security-based configurations for
Hmm.
firewalls or whatever. They overlap in those areas. They also overlap in communications or actually transmission, data transmission, where there's
Okay.
encryption required for both frameworks for the data that passes through. They overlap in audit logging as well because audit logs are required for, looking at alerts and looking at system activity and that type of thing. They overlap there, and then also in incident response, they overlap in that particular area. And then risk management is another area where they overlap at. And so all these particular areas that I named or represents a domain in high trust, of course.
Correct.
And
Hmm.
then they also represent an area in CMMC where, it's not domain, but it's actually a topic or however they classify it. That's where these particular frameworks overlap. Now, I also notice where they are different as well. And they're different in number one, industry focus. Because with high trust, it's more ideal in the healthcare arena. It's ideal in the fintech because all of the different versions that it's been just pretty much based on now, it's actually moved from being healthcare specific to maybe it could be utilized in fintech or financial technology, excuse me.
Hmm.
And so, and I've actually done an R2 with a finance organization that used the high trust platform. So it can be done where it was once just pretty much
Right.
healthcare
Focused
related.
on, yeah, it focused on healthcare and then kind of expanded out to understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, where it differentiates from CMMC is just required for DoD contractors. And
Well, yeah, and I think that's where, I was kind of wondering if, because I guess there's like a push right now that every DoD contractor would need to have a CMMC certification. And kind of
mhm.
my question had been, well, would HITRUST be a substitute for that, an equivalent, if you got an R2 HITRUST certification, would you be able to kind of match that over? And I guess, part of it also is, I'm assuming HITRUST will, if they don't already have it, have a mapping in HITRUST CSF to CMMC. So you can kind of see, or even a combined assessment. So maybe you do an I1 plus CMMC and get a certification.
Huh. That's interesting. I don't think they have that in place as of yet.
Okay.
Because from what I'm seeing so far, it seems like CMMC is carrying its own certification path, and its own set of requirements
Okay.
outside of any other framework where it's not actually combining, like SOC does with HITRUST. SOC 1 and 2 can be combined with HITRUST, and you can get a particular certification that encapsulates both of
Right.
those frameworks. But I don't think you can do that with CMMC as of yet.
As of yet. So it would be a separate.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Separate.
so it sounds like it is third party risk management, because I know that's huge in HITRUST as well. Does that seem to have come into play? The suppliers of my suppliers, the vendors of my vendors, kind of that upstream or even downstream from a business associate perspective. Is that
It's
kind of helpful or important in CMMC?
it's not as important as it is in HITRUST, because
Okay.
HITRUST has a whole lot more requirements for that particular control area. CUMC has some, but it's kind of broad and it's left open to interpretation,
Okay.
much like HIPAA. If you may not have it, but you may have something comparable. Where with HITRUST, it's a little more binary, where you have to have it, and if you don't have it, then you're
Yeah.
going to be put on a cap. I don't think that's the case with CMMC. If you have some level of the third-party management or vendor management, maybe if you answer questionnaires or if you deal with any type of third-party management due diligence, then it's not going to be something that's going to require all of it. Like HITRUST requires everything that deals with due diligence.
Right. But is that
CMMC does not.
Oh, sorry. Is that
That's okay.
because the DoD actually contractually restricts whether or not you can subcontract something or what your supply chain looks
Mm-hmm.
like? Because I feel like the healthcare industry is more about they have to have the controls because they really can't. You might be able to have one client who has restrictions on, what you can and can't do, but from a HIPAA or government perspective, it's not like they can say, well, you can only do business with vendors that we pre-approve, right? But the DoD can. So I'm
Exactly.
wondering if it's not there
Less
because
important because, yeah.
they have much tighter reins on things like on that type of activity.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe so. That's another one of those unknown areas with this, because it's still somewhat in its infancy. CMMC, I think they're just really getting around to just making this something that you have to have a certification in order to actually operate to get these DoD contracts. Because I know that if
Hmm.
you're going to bid for a DoD contract of some type, then you have to meet these levels of controls for that particular framework,
Mhm.
Yeah,
and
and I
that
guess it's
requirement is
different.
new.
It's different
Yeah,
in the market because like HITRUST, it takes they have to kind of hone their message in order to get that
yeah.
market share.
Mhm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it always seems like with the government, it's like, well, we're just going to declare this has to happen, and then things kind of start formulating, as that deadline looms nearer. Similar to I used to work a long time ago with a company that did tax returns to the IRS, and they were just getting started with e-file. And they were making it a mandate that companies of a certain size had to e-file in a particular year. And we were scrambling because at that point, they were not clear as far as what their requirements were for e-filing and for transmitting the tax return, and then what you got back as far as, you know, the validation that yes, or the acknowledgement that the tax return was received, and then the acknowledgement later that it was rejected or approved. And they were still in the process of even putting together what that looked like, but yet they were forcing, and it was General Electric, I think, was the largest tax return, and that was the one they were starting with. And I was like, why wouldn't you start with a small subset of, like, you know, a small business, and have
That's
like,
true.
okay, the first 1,000 small businesses get to do this. But no, they started with, you know, okay, GE needs to do this, and everybody else by, you know, next year has to follow in. But it just seems like the government kind of goes, okay, we're going to demand this, and then we're going to figure out what the product looks like, versus you know, in the free market society, you have to kind of figure out what the product is, and then you get the market for it. So okay, so it does seem like it's kind of like that. And I know CMMC is much more kind of more like a SOC with trust principles, or, you know, like you should do something like this, you know, kind of more like HIPAA, where it's like, you know, an independent audit, but it doesn't require, like HITRUST would be, you need an external auditor and you need to do, you know, XYZ. You know, it's just going, well, you define what independence looks like as far as an audit, or you define, you know, what your parameters are for transmission, versus HITRUST is very or even like password management. HITRUST is very specific with password management, even though maybe the platforms have moved on past that. And, you know, these vendors are even saying, well, don't expire passwords because that's not useful anymore. But HITRUST is still like, all right, expire your passwords every 60 days. And you kind of run into that, you know.
I'm curious though. So DoD doesn't require a certified external assessor?
No,
Are they going soft?
For HIPAA, no, HIPAA requires, and I did this because I had it in my head, external assessor. But no, HIPAA requirements are an independent assessment.
Oh, HIPAA, yeah, but the CMMC, I mean,
I don't know, CMMC.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I know HIPAA doesn't fundamentally require, but I mean, having gone through reviews of assessments myself, if it's not third party reviewed, it's not worth anything.
Right.
Well, like in this particular client was kind of saying, you know, because I was like, oh yeah, it just says independent, because he was calling me out on it, going, it doesn't say external assessor, and I'm like, oh, you know, I read the language again in HIPAA, and I'm like, okay, yeah, it's not, it says independent assessment. I said, so, you know, if you've got an internal audit team or a compliance team, and he's like, or I could do it and then just send it to management, and I'm like, okay.
Right.
I was like, as long as somebody's independently reviewing it, okay, I guess you're hitting the spirit of, you know. And so I was like, but it doesn't say, it just says independent assessment or independent review. So I was like, okay, you know, I said, just document who it was you reviewed your stuff with, and make sure that they were qualified to do that. You know, I was like, you're going to be the one defending it if anything happens, because
exactly. You know, with CMMC, it also requires, like, I believe it's 3 levels of assessments that it has to go through, with level 1 being somewhat baseline, but then there's levels 2 and 3 that would require, I think, a certified assessor at some point. You have to be someone that's certified in that particular area. So is that true about CMMC?
Again,
Their
I'm still
first level
learning.
is more of an internal assessment, where it's internal somewhat, and they may have an advisor or someone that would probably manage that particular part of the assessment. But then it's supposed to move into levels 2 and 3. I know it's 3 levels of assessments. Levels 2 and 3 has to be actually done by a certified practitioner for CMMC framework. So is that true for this particular framework?
I don't know. I've heard that there's different levels, and I've heard like the score is like 110 or something like that. You're supposed to score to say that you're ready for a CMMC certification or review. So I don't know if level 1 is kind of the way like PCI does it, where, you know, and they call it tier 3. But, you know, if you can just self-attest, and, you know, if that's sufficient with a level 1 CMMC, I'll have to do some more research on that and see.
I got to look into that too. Let me write that down. Yeah.
Because that, I mean, if that's all that's required this first year, I don't
Hmm.
think as many people are going to panic. I did read an article today. I just skimmed it about the fact that, how Doge is going through the Department of Government Efficiency is kind of going through and, looking in detail at every contractor and every contract with the government. And this article was kind of like, well, if you have a CMMC certification, you can typically get that approval from Doge to
Oh,
continue doing. And again, I don't know if
interesting.
this was a resident expert that was saying that or whatever. It's just something I happened to read. And I'm like, oh, is that how people are going to, kind of leverage their CMMC certifications? But if it's an
Hmm.
if level one is truly a self-attestation, there's probably not nearly the panic that I was expecting there to be in the market that, oh my gosh, we're here in
Exactly.
June. And by the end of the year, we have to be CMMC certified. Because if you needed to be HITRUST certified, you probably could do it with an E1 from June to December.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could get an I1 or an R2. Definitely, I would try to do an R2 starting in June and trying to get it done by December.
No, no.
So, and that's where I
Um,
kept thinking, well, why am I not seeing panic in the market about CMMC?
well, and that's where if that first level is self-assessment and there's significant overlap with equal or more stringent frameworks
Hmm.
like FedRAMP, like HITRUST, where they cover a range of similar areas, and the areas where CMMC maybe isn't as strict are because you contractually can't do that anyways. So
Yeah.
they've got that buttoned up from a different approach. But I think based on what we've discussed so far, I'd probably be comfortable comparing a CMMC. If I already had HITRUST or FedRAMP in-house, I'd be comfortable looking at those controls and going, right, so where did I sit in my last assessment by an external auditor, and just doing a map and
Mhm.
saying,
Yeah.
right, okay, here's, how I measure up on that, and then moving forward from there. Because it's if it is something that's going to be required by DoD, it sounds like it's more of a, administrative process than it is, kind of a
An
rigorous
actual security
evaluation.
control. Yeah.
And you want to make
Exactly.
sure, frankly, that you've got a different security assessment process before you even head into this one.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, that would make
Um,
sense.
with CMMC, the certification for CMMC, and again, this is all Department of Defense based. So you cannot compare these on a commercial basis. Like with
Hmm.
HITRUST, you can market the certification commercially, and they could see, or a client can see that you have the HITRUST R2 validated certification, and they can say, well, if you have that, then you're probably SOC compliant as well, or we know that you're HIPAA compliant,
Hmm.
and so that can actually cause them to actually waive requirements for maybe SOC 2 or for HIPAA or
Hmm.
whatever. You can't do the same with CMMC, even though
Okay.
all the controls in CMMC, if you pass a HITRUST R2 assessment, then you've essentially passed the CMMC certification as
Hmm.
well because of that overlap of those controls that HITRUST meets, and then also it surpasses as well. So if you get an R2 certification with HITRUST, then of course you could do the same in CMMC,
Hmm.
but that won't be the case because CMMC is in its own little box, which is
Right.
federal government, and it's pretty much government based and doesn't go outside of that
Right.
like
And
SOC does.
is it like FedRAMP where you have to have a sponsor in order to even go through it?
Yeah,
Okay, so you can't even get there until you know that you want to pursue a specific contract or piece of business with the
exactly.
DoD. And right, so this is where it goes back to, now I'm even more in the camp of go in already with a HITRUST
Right.
certification, because now you already need to make sure that you've got everything ticked, because if you're in the middle of a contract process, you're either going to get approved or you're not. And if you don't
Mhm.
get approved, the contract will go elsewhere. So this is where you really want to make sure that you are that step ahead in,
Mhm.
getting prepared and being super confident on the upswing,
Absolutely.
going into the CMMC. It's not going to be you know, col collaborative discussion like some of the HITRUST, assessments are. And I'm not saying that in that HITRUST isn't stringent, but you can take corrective action plans. Um,
Oh, yeah.
I, is does CMMC permit that, or is it like tick, 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 you meet these, you
Yes
don't
or
meet
no?
these, who's the next contract candidate? Um,
Exactly. And it's contractually driven. I mean, this is all based off of bidding, with
mhm,
the CMMC, when high trust is pretty much driven by demand. The CMMC is pretty much contract eligibility. So there's a checklist of items that you have to actually, answer and have to
mhm,
actually comply towards in order to be considered,
mhm,
in this whole bidding process. With high trust, it's pretty much demand driven, because you could have a client that would demand for you, or demand their third parties to actually have this particular certification, whether
mhm.
it's R2, I1, or E1. But that's not the case with CMMC. It's pretty much driven by all of the bidding and the
Right.
organizations that are bidding for a contract,
Right.
pretty much.
Now,
Yeah.
I find it interesting, and I wonder whether or not the the DoD has considered um, requiring, a level one kind of self attestation along with a
Yeah.
collaborative certification. Like you can only enter this bidding process if you have that attestation of your own entity plus either HITRUST or FedRAMP or something else that says you're not coming into this on the fly and wasting our time. You're
Right.
coming in with a very high level of confidence that you're going to be successful. Uh,
Hmm.
because that, I think it just speaks to better efficiency and process. Why would the
Mhm.
DoD want to be reviewing, entities which are unlikely to be successful
Yeah.
or have no basis to say that they have confidence in their success?
Exactly. Exactly. Um, CMMC, like I said, it's three levels
Mm,
of certifications, or three levels of assessments, and there are also two separate levels of assessors. I think with that first level, I think that assessment, or that certificated, or excuse me, of that certified professional that needs to interact with the particular client,
mhm,
is acts as an advisor, so to
mhm,
speak. And they perform that internal assessment process, and I believe that an advisor signs off on it
mhm,
before it goes
Okay.
to level 2 and levels 3, because levels 2 and 3 requires a higher level certification, for the person that's going to actually perform the assessment.
mhm.
uh, but I think that first level is more of an internal assessment with the aid or the help of an advisor.
Of a
This
trained
advisor
person.
has to
Okay.
sign off on it before it goes to the other levels.
Okay.
Mhm.
And just out of curiosity, because I have looked at, while I'm not high trust certified and I don't intend to become an assessor for high trust, I'm an independent
Yeah.
consultant primarily. I have freelancers and folks that I work with, but for the most part, I'm independent. And it so I've taken a look at high trust model. It doesn't really fit with what I do. So
Mhm.
for high trust, I typically work with clients and I go in and what was the word used? Sherpa. I think somebody called me a Sherpa. So I go in and I sit with the clients and I guide that process from the inside of the organization. But
Mhm.
I'm curious, how does one can somebody from outside the DoD become certified or be in that position to help assess? Or is that restricted to like certain military personnel or previous employees of the DoD?
I believe that sponsorship. I
Okay.
believe that has to be
So even
sponsored.
that sponsorship. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think, just like with high trust,
Yeah.
you can actually, you don't have to have a sponsor to sign off on you to go in and take the course and get the certification. But I know with CMMC, I think that's the case with getting that
Okay.
particular certification. You have to have a sponsor organization that would sign off on it.
Okay.
I believe that's just,
Okay.
what I've
Yeah, I don't know
seen.
enough about it, but it's
Yeah.
a
It's just
good
curious.
question to ask. And that was one of the questions that I had was, training, because it's very straightforward for high
Mhm.
trust to get training on how to be that advisor or an
Hmm.
actual assessor, because
Hmm.
you can go through the certified practitioner training with HITRUST. It's a week
Yeah,
long. You take a test at the end, and then you're certified for a year. And then there's the refresher courses for 2 years, and then you
refresh.
have to re-up.
Hmm.
And then to
Yeah,
be a certified or validated assessor, there's an additional quality or QSA process or something that requires additional training for how to
yeah.
conduct the audits and what the work papers look like and how you sample and all of that. So it goes into more depth with that. And I was curious about CMMC and what that
Hmm.
training requires and who's offering CMMC certified training, and that. But it sounds like so it's one or two groups that are offering that certification training so that you can say I'm CMMC certified as, an advisor or as an assessor.
Right. And it
Okay.
has a governing body that actually provides the course and the training for that.
Okay.
Hmm.
And again, in order to get through that training, and from what I've seen, and I'm like you, I have to look into this a little deeper because I am interested in pursuing that myself.
Hmm.
Um, but I know that it has to be sponsored by, let's say, if you work with a consulting firm like Provoxy or Coalfire or someone, they would have to actually sponsor that and sign off on you being
Okay.
able to actually participate in the training and also participate in the exam. Now, I
Hmm.
know that first level of courses, I heard that there's no exam required. You're just required to go through the course or the boot
Okay.
camp. I think that's a whole week process. Now, to get the certification to be able to assess on levels 2 and 3, now that's going to require a course and an exam.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes
Hmm.
sense.
Interesting. And does
Yeah.
Coalfire, I mean, so I know that Coalfire offers that CMMC training. Is there a place that offers, and is it training for independent consultants, or is it only training for clients or people who want to be assessors? Is it, I'm just trying to understand,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
is there a source to offer training? Because I gotta say, my sweet spot, that where I enjoy, I think the most,
Hmm.
isn't necessarily sitting on the assessor side, although hands up, I haven't done it. Maybe I'd love it. Um, but I really enjoy sitting in with the clients and guiding that process, because
Yeah.
it's being able to kind of add that calming, like, okay, right, we can do this, we can do
Right.
this,
Hmm. Hmm.
like, here's the plan of action that we have, and being able to provide that um, roadmap where they can see, because it seems like this really scary big thing. And being able to provide that roadmap is something that it's something I've really enjoyed, and
Hmm.
partnering with
Right.
the clients to help deliver that so they can be successful in what they're required. It's usually because they're required to do it either by, an investor or a funding agency
Yeah.
or a client, it's somebody pushing them to say, you have to do
Mhm.
this.
Exactly. And what you just explained is what's required for the advisor.
Hmm.
That's kind of like how you would interact with the client
Okay.
for that level 1 assessment,
Hmm.
where you're guiding
Okay.
them through that process because it has its own set of requirements for that level.
Hmm.
Level 2 has its own set of requirements, just as level 3.
Yeah.
And so you're guiding them through those baseline requirements, which is level 1.
Hmm.
And then once they meet all of those controls, and I think it's 100 controls they have to actually comply towards.
Hmm.
Once they actually meet that and they show you the evidence and you approve of the evidence, then you sign off. And then it goes to that next level of assessment, which
Okay.
also requires that next level assessor as
Okay.
well.
And
Yeah.
do you know, and this might be helpful for me to understand in terms of
Hmm.
how I pursue training. Do the level one, level two, and level three assessors all have to be different? So if if you, for example, hold, all three levels of capability, all certifications for all three levels, so you can assess one, two, and three, can you actually do that for a client? Or if you do one of those levels, do the other two levels have to be done by different people?
That's
Does the question I asked make sense?
Hmm.
Yes, it does. It
Okay.
does. And I don't know, but I do know that all 3 levels you can actually, like level 1, you can get the certification for that just as you can, because that's actually the certification path that the governing bodies offer. They
Hmm.
offer you the level one
Hmm.
and then the levels 2 and 3 as well. So I don't see why, like if you have all levels, the certification for all 3 levels, I don't see why they would deviate from you to go with someone else, especially when you set through level one with them, when you already know the environment, you already
Hmm.
know their control makeup, you already know the business model. So why would they deviate from you if you also have levels 2 and 3 um, certification? So I don't. That's a good question. I
Well,
really don't know.
yeah, and that's why I was asking because
Yeah.
the practicality of it says it would be easier to use the same person for all three. But
Mm-hmm.
the risk and compliance side of me says
Independence
that's like
side, yeah.
editing your or kind of assessing your own
Exactly.
work. Do I
Yeah.
think I get a
That's
good
true.
did I do a good job? Yes, you did. That's an A. You
Right.
know?
Right. Well, and it's the same way that these for high trust, the same way that you have an advisory services group and then
Uh-huh.
an assessment group or validated assessment group. So you maintain that independence because the last thing you want is, you as an entity have said, "Oh, yeah, this evidence is great," and then you have to come back and go, "Oh, you know what? It's not adequate."
Hmm.
And so
Absolutely.
I think I mean, I think if I were an assessed entity looking for CMMC and I was going to go to level two, I'd be like, no,
Hmm.
I want somebody else to check. And maybe I'm just biased because I'm so used to the high trust methodology of doing that. And I see the value in somebody's
Absolutely.
helped gather that evidence and said, you know what, I as an organization think we're here. And then it's very helpful to have an independent person come back and go, that's not quite
That's
it.
true.
But, so hopefully they follow that model. But
Yeah.
I can see the benefit of not following that model and letting somebody who's a level three certified person
Hmm.
take you through all three of those. And I don't
Right.
know if you have to move through all three. I mean, can you say, hey, I want to be level two certified and skip level one? Or do you have to go through that level one first in order to get to level two?
Yeah, you have to go through level one
Okay.
first. As
Mm.
far as 2 and 3 goes, I don't know. I
Okay.
Okay.
don't know for that. But
Eh,
you mentioned something that's so true. You want to eliminate that bias aspect of
mhm.
someone being biased, in the midst of an audit or in the midst of an assessment. Because me being an ex-auditor as well, I wouldn't accept anything from maybe someone that maybe assessed it. I knew they was probably an employee there or have relations there of some type
Mhm.
to where I see that everything they marked is something that's favorable to the organization. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of
How
sense.
independent does that independent review have to be?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you already, you may have covered this and I just didn't fully absorb
Mhm.
what you were saying, but the level one, level two, and level three. So are there different DoD contracts that actually require different levels? So are there maybe some contracts that only require level one? Or is that the starting place across all and all the contracts require you have to
Yeah.
get to level three?
I know it's a starting place. Now, as far
Okay.
as the 2 and 3 go, I don't know if all of that it's bundled together.
Okay.
I know level one is a starting place. That's the
Okay.
initial starting place, and it requires, an advisor to actually sign off before it goes to the next levels. Because if you have the certification, then you're qualified for the contract.
Hmm.
Whatever contract you're bidding for makes you qualified for that particular contract.
Hmm.
So I don't know how levels 2 and 3 plays into that whole qualification process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, if you
Yeah.
get your CMMC certification and you don't get the contract, do you get to still hold on to the certification and bid
Oh,
for something else?
well, most companies bid for more than one contract. There's always a lot of other
Okay.
contracts. So yeah, probably so. I would say,
Okay.
yeah, why would they put you through the process all over again if one
Yeah, if that's for the
certified,
same system, yeah.
Hmm.
yeah,
Because I'm assuming it's like high trust where you certify the system and
Yeah.
not the entire
right,
organization.
I just
exactly.
wasn't sure based on the sponsorship factor.
Right.
So does the
Mhm.
CMMC certification stick if you didn't get that first contract? So you don't officially have a sponsor, but you did pass all the steps,
Yeah.
right? Because if there was three companies and they all passed the steps, and then you got to the end and they're like, we're going to go with this person because they, they're the cheapest, good,
That's
good
true.
decision making. They're the cheapest. We're going to go with them.
That's
And
true.
thanks for playing, everybody else. And we appreciate your time, and on you go. So
Hmm.
that's why I was just curious about whether or not it sticks, if like how that sponsorship kind of moves from there.
Right. Well, it is a bidding process. It
Mm,
is a bidding process, and more than one organization bids on the same contract. So,
yeah.
but you also bid on more than one contract yourself. I've
Okay.
been involved in bidding for government contracts, and
Hmm.
we went for more than just one. You
Sure.
know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
No, and that makes sense. So you can, that's interesting. So you can participate in the CMMC certification process during your contract bid
Hmm.
while you're bidding for more than one thing.
Exactly.
Okay,
Hmm.
that's
Cool.
pretty cool.
That's
And
I
right.
I
like that.
also wonder if states are going to follow this similar to how FedRAMP and state ramp type of programs would work. Because I know, the states all have maybe their own particular rules, but they may use CMMC level one as their baseline and then say,
Hmm.
okay, in addition, over and above to bid on our state run things,
Mm.
you would also need to do that. So I wonder if that's coming as well. But if, or, maybe they're waiting to see how CMMC plays out at the federal level first. But yeah,
Hmm.
I've definitely got to do more research and more focus on what it is, and is there panic? Should there be panic? And everybody has to be CMMC certified in order to do business with the DoD. Because like, what if there's an ongoing contract? I can't imagine that the DoD sets up just a 1 year contract. So if you're contracted out from last year and you're
Yeah.
year one of a year three 3 year contract, do you still have to go through that CMMC certification? And to Don's point, what happens if you don't pass that and you're
Mm.
1/3 of the way through your contract already with them? Or are they grandfathering you in to say, well, as long as you're certified by the next time we renew or something?
Interesting.
So still a lot of unknowns with it sounds like.
Yeah, and it's in its infancy as well.
Hmm.
So those unknowns are probably because of it being in its infancy right now.
Right.
And I'm quite sure that as it continues to progress, because I think it's going to make its way out into the public instead of just being government. I think it's going to make its way out into the public sector and in the
Hmm.
commercial
Hmm.
sector as well.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, I've not seen FedRAMP do that, but I think that's
Hmm.
because FedRAMP is so stringent and that's just not cost effective for an organization to say, yeah, I'm going to require that same level. Within, I don't know if many organizations could do that, but I could
Yeah.
definitely see the formality. But then again, and that's where I kind of wonder, but when that happens, would kind of the way SOC 2 used to be the definitive standard, and then HITRUST comes in or ISO 27001 comes in, and can you say, I need this assessment or similar? And can you then say, well, I've invested all this time and effort into HITRUST, which is at or exceeds a level 2 or level 3 certification.
Hmm.
So does that, and that's kind of where my original question came in, was, well, how would
Yeah.
you balance those two out? And but I guess this, no matter what assessment you go through, keep the evidence that you've been using for that assessment,
Oh,
Hmm.
yes.
because just in case you need to reuse it. So
Yeah.
and I think, Donna, you had done a discussion, or maybe we can do that for another topic, for another future, is how to save and categorize and organize your evidence so that it's
Hmm.
very easy to come back to, um,
It's my
and
fun place. Yeah.
exactly.
Said
Yeah,
no one ever except Donna.
except
Um,
Donna.
but
Exactly.
absolutely, just to tick back to something you'd said about FedRAMP, not do, so my understanding is, and this is why I was asking about the sponsorship and the official certification, because my understanding for FedRAMP is you cannot achieve certification without a federal level sponsor. So you can go through all the hoops you want, but if you don't have a federal level sponsor, you're not getting certified because you have to have that in order to get there. Now,
Right.
state ramp has been an interesting development because state ramp is actually moderate FedRAMP.
Hmm.
So if
Yeah.
you were thinking about FedRAMP in the future, achieving state ramp is a fairly good stepping stone. And then
Hmm.
you know that you've got most of the way there, and you can kind of strategically figure out what else you would need to bridge that final gap. But you can get most of the way there with a state ramp certification,
Hmm.
Hmm.
because it does have that kind of moderate level of security controls. And this is where like things are evolving, because state ramp has that organization, which grew out of an assessor organization, actually, and some of the
Yeah.
same leadership team. Um, and they have managed to get a number of states, growing number of states. I think last time I looked, it was 30 states and counting
Oh,
in terms
nice.
of reciprocity.
Hmm.
So if you got text ramp, you could get, state ramp reciprocity, and then from there, that could be applied to a number of other states in
Yeah.
terms of expanding your, sphere of potential
Right. Where you can
clients.
operate. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
which makes a big difference. And a lot of people didn't understand up front that they're like, oh, well, we work with all private hospitals. Are you sure? You sure none of those hospitals, like the university hospitals, accept any state funds? Because those
Yeah.
hospitals, then anybody who accepts state money in a
Hmm.
lot of these states are subject to local state ramp requirements.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if it funds their whole thing. It could be like a $5,000
Yeah. One patient.
stipend
And yeah.
for a tiny program. Doesn't matter. If they accept state funds, they have to do, the local state
Yeah.
requirements. And, so it's just a blanket thing, but it is interesting how all of these are so infiltrated. And I'd love to get to more of a sphere where we could actually talk about all the different certifications in one conference, so
Yeah.
that we can go, right, okay, so I'm shopping for a certification, and this is SOC 2, and this is FedRAMP, and that's state ramp, and that's CMMC, and this is HITRUST. And, each of these programs also has different levels, whether it's the E1 and the R2, or, the three different levels of CMMC. It would be great to have that kind of a program
Matrix.
where you
Right.
can go
Yeah.
in and go,
Yeah.
okay, here's my organization, here's what business I'm in, here's what I want to do, here's the geographic jurisdictions I want to operate in, or maybe the government jurisdictions I want to operate in, and what do I need? What do I need to get there? Because I don't
Right.
think there's a single source that's a fully informed entity at the moment that can
Hmm.
give that perspective and go, here you go. This is your roadmap with confidence to get you where you want to go.
So
Right.
I guess we're just now brainstorming a new AI tool that we will market
Ta-da!
and sell.
Pretty much. Pretty much.
And we will all
Yeah,
be rich and retire in a couple of months when we get this, when
yeah.
we
Exactly.
vibe code this and get this
hmm
out to the market.
And then
Yeah.
we can map it back to those 400 questionnaires.
Exactly.
I already have a business case for that. That would save everybody money. You could
I
make a
know.
ton of money on
They
that,
would
and
throw, yeah,
everybody using it would still save
they
millions.
would still owe us.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's that crazy, the amount of spending.
Oh yeah. Oh,
Oh
I
yeah.
remember, because the CISO of United Health Group back in the day was out on the board of directors for HITRUST.
hmm
And
Hmm.
I was working at a business associate, and the one of the auditors from there had his own questionnaire. And I was like, dude, we're HITRUST certified. And he's like, well, I still want to go through. And I'm like,
Oh
why
yeah.
don't you ask your CISO? Because he's on the board of HITRUST. And if he doesn't believe in this, but he wanted his own. He had his, he'd been 15 years in the business, and this was what he did and asked. And I'm like, no, no, no. We're going to call a meeting with your CISO, because this isn't going to stand. I mean, this was the whole reason why this particular business
Exactly.
associate went,
Yeah.
was because they were our largest customer, and they were always asking about HITRUST. And I was like,
Yep.
we're not doing HITRUST and your own questionnaire and audit.
Yeah.
It just
No,
isn't
I
happening.
I actually provided a list I did my research because I had to get the HITRUST certificate when I was client side,
Hmm.
and heading up risk and compliance for a health tech company, and publicly traded one at that. I used to regularly reach out to the head of sales and go, right, here are all the clients we have who sit on the TPRM
Yep.
board that
Yeah,
says we commit to using HITRUST for our
Right.
third
exactly.
party validation. And if you see a questionnaire from any of these entities, you should reach out to their CIO or their
Yep.
CISO or their
When
CTO
they look at the
because they
list
are
of
not
names,
doing
yeah,
what they're supposed to be
exactly.
doing. But I would regularly provide that to the sales team because
Hmm.
they,
Yeah.
and I talked to the sales team, and it's not that they were, were experts on HITRUST, but they said that was often a differentiator for the company. And, I
Hmm.
was a little surprised at first because it has all these bells and whistles. The technology itself was pretty cool, but it wasn't alone in the field, and
Hmm.
HITRUST was a really big differentiator. And then it was supposed to be that we're going to get this and then we don't have to do the questionnaires. And the questionnaires just kept coming.
Hmm.
And I thought, this
Yeah.
is really ridiculous. Like, how do we get this to stop? And I actually do have a business case, a researched, footnoted business case
Yeah.
that I'd be happy to share with anybody who's interested, that actually talks about how much money is spent going through questionnaires where they actually have no hope of finding anything useful
Hmm.
because it's, just any person answering a questionnaire the way that they want to.
Right.
And so it's almost entirely on blind trust. Do you trust this answer or do you not trust this answer?
Hmm.
Right.
Um,
And that's what
and
we
there's
found is
no
that,
validation. And
right,
if even if they answer all the questions 100% honest, like how are you finding the red flags among 400 questions when
right,
half of them are, do you have this policy? Can we see this policy? Yes, I have this policy.
Oh
No, you
my
can't see
goodness.
it. I'm
right.
Yeah.
not going to show you the policies or the procedures that we have internally because that alone would increase our risk that we use to protect your data.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there were so many times that you'd get that, the questionnaire coming in and then it would be like, well, prove this. And you're like, okay, what does your contract say? Do you have the right to audit? So if you have the right to audit, I can introduce you
Yeah.
to that customer audit team and they can take you through whatever,
Hmm.
canned response we have. But if you don't
Hmm.
have a right to audit, here's our high trust certification. And here are the
Right.
systems that are covered in it. And I'm sorry, but that's going to have to do.
Exactly.
But it goes back to the job protection mode and the people who
Hmm.
are, leading those efforts on the questionnaires don't want to be the ones to abandon the questionnaire and then have a breach.
Right.
It's the same reason that, when big consultant firms are hired and they're being paid big bucks, even when a
Hmm.
smaller consultant could do the same thing, because nobody's going to get fired for hiring,
A big
IBM
name.
or Deloitte. That's a trusted, consultancy. You can bring them in,
Hmm.
but they're it, it's no guarantee that you're heading down the right path. It just
Yeah.
means you're going to spend an incredible amount of money, whether you achieve what you want or not.
Yeah.
That's true.
Well, and the questionnaires can be difficult because a lot of times they're just yes, no. And so even something as simple as, do you use multi-factor authentication?
Hmm.
Yes, but maybe not for the system that you're asking about because
Right?
it's old and it doesn't support it. But yeah, we use it, and so again, that's when you still have the, okay, I answered it. But to your point, how do you trust that that really is fully answering the question that I have? Because my question really is, what steps do you take to make sure that the covered data is protected? And,
Exactly.
and I think that's where an assessment, and it's interesting to see CMMC versus FedRAMP because I'm like, well, I mean, FedRAMP's always been for the DoD,
Hmm.
and now why do we have CMMC? You know,
Right.
so like, why didn't we just take what FedRAMP was? Unless it's so arduous, because I know FedRAMP can be very arduous.
Hmm.
And is that
Hmm.
is that too much for a vendor that may not need to be at that level because the information that they're holding, transmitting, or updating
Yeah.
isn't that material
Mhm.
of information. And so maybe
Right.
a level 1 or level 2 is sufficient.
Mhm.
But yeah, I have
Yeah.
nightmares that like a CMMC level 3 is probably like a FedRAMP high. I don't know, but that's where I look at it and go, well, how much higher could it be?
Right. That makes sense. We
But
have research to do. We have a lot of
we
research to
Yeah.
do. We do have more research to do, research and
Absolutely.
report. So
Absolutely.
stay tuned.
I'm on it.
But yeah, and again, because we're not going to solve this dilemma of multiple assessments, I think having that evidence to collect and store and be able to retrieve is going to be very important, because that's the biggest thing with audit fatigue. When you go back to these departments and you go back again and again and say, I need
Yeah.
this information. I need it again. I need it for this set of users instead of that set of users. That's really
Mhm.
where these teams are like, oh, I'm not in the security business. I'm in the hiring and, background check business.
Mhm.
And why do I have to keep doing this?
Yeah.
But, and
Yeah.
hopefully integration, more integration of systems would help that as well, from a compliance standpoint. That I'd always asked people, just can you give me a dashboard or a report so that I don't have to keep bugging you each time I have to go
Right.
get another list of audit logs. Just give me a dashboard that has the audit logs, the data that I need to be able, so that I
Mhm.
can just run it. And oh, it didn't quite get what I needed, I can go back and run it again instead of asking you for it.
Exactly.
But we'll solve world hunger next, after we
Okay.
do the after we do our
That
after we do
sounds
our,
great.
our little AI bot that talks about your roadmap for certification and what you need.
Yeah,
So we'll
that
start
sounds
on
great.
that.
Kevin, I put both of those. It seems like you probably know Sue, but I just, for good measure, put both of our LinkedIn profiles there.
Okay.
In
It'd be
chat.
great to connect. Yeah, in the
Okay.
chat. Sorry for the call. So it'd be great to connect
Oh, of
if you get a
course.
chance.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Consider it done.
Well, good discussion today. More
Yeah,
discussion. So we'll have CMMC part 2, part 3, as we get
Absolutely.
closer to this end of the year deadline for
yeah.
what it is. And I know
Mhm.
Richard will be on, I think, next week. I think he'll have
Okay,
availability next week. And I think
great.
he's got one, when talking with Brian, who's their colleagues at the same company. And I brought this question up when Brian was on the call, and he's like, I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I know Richard does. So
Hmm.
we'll probably readdress this question again and post another episode of it.
That'll be
And the
good.
more the merrier. So if people are watching this recorded, you've got updates, put them in the comments,
Sure.
and join a discussion coming up. So
Yeah.
Mhm.
And if we can collect information about all of these different frameworks, I can start putting together just a presentation. We can do the presentation at one point, or we can just post it to a website as source material to
Mhm.
reference. That way, people have a guide to go to say, well, right, I'm looking at SOC 2, but I've heard it's not, that I need high trust, and you know,
Yeah.
because I think it can be really confusing to be in that
mhm.
initial position where you're not really sure which one to go. And depending on the assessor you speak to and what they're certified to deliver, you
Right,
might get a biased opinion
right. If they're
Right.
only
versus
used to
somebody
hammers, you're going to get a hammer.
you're going to get a hammer. Yeah. So, let me know if as and when anybody comes with information, I'm happy to start collecting it and putting together some
Okay.
sort of a centralized presentation or clickable PDF, something super fancy.
Ooh,
Okay.
yeah. Perfect.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks, Donna. Thanks,
Thanks,
Kevin.
everybody.
All
Absolutely. Thank you as well.
right.
Have a great day.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.